There is a new palette master element out, version 1.3.13. This is the most recent release. I know many of you have been asking me questions about it. Should you upgrade? Is the program stable? How is the calibration result from this version? So I have been doing testing on both Mac and PC, and here are my new recommendations for this version, which for the most part will remain the same as version 1.3.12 with some minor tweaks here and there after doing a lot more testing with Palette Master Element, at least with these recent release versions. So let's find out together. I'm Art and ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. Let's briefly go over BenQ SW display lineup before we talk about Palette Master Element 1.3.13. This is going to give you a good background of why certain displays or certain generation of these displays may not work with this software version combination. If you'd like to skip ahead to the result and the best calibration setting, you can use a timestamp in the description below. So to start us out, I have broken down BenQ SW display line into 3 separate generations. We have the original, the SW 2700 PT. This is the one with the manufacture date 2015 to 2016. The best way to find out which version you have is to look at the regulation tag on the back of the display, similar to what you see on the screen right now. There is a line called the MFG date. That is the manufacture date of the display. If yours is within 2015 or 2016, you have the previous firmware version. Moving on to the next generation display, and these are pretty much, I would say all these are current so far, beside one of them in the list there, which is the SW320 that has been discontinued. The SW2700 PT with a manufacture date of 2017 to current, that's also considered to be the next generation display, or that's kind of what I would name that way. And then we have the SW240 and the SW271. In the next column, we have the USB Type-C generation. Some of you may say that the SW271 does have USB Type-C. Yes, it does, but it doesn't have the C moniker in the name, number one. And secondly, that USB Type-C does not do power delivery in any meaningful way that will really power your laptop, which is the reason why I didn't include that in the USB Type-C generation. So for the Type-C generation, we have the SW270C, SW321C, and the newly announced SW271C, which I believe this version, the Palette Master Element 1.3.13, will also work with the SW271C when that display launches as well. Next up, let's quickly talk about the LUT inside the display. So on the SW2700 PT, the original version and the new version, and also on any of the next generation display that you see there, it has a 14-bit lookup table inside the display that's built in. The difference between the next generation and the original is that if you have the original SW2700 PT, the only RGB primary that you can calibrate that display to when you use Palette Master Element is panel native. And when you get to that screen, pretty much you don't have the drop-down list for the RGB primary. That's another way to tell if you have the previous firmware version of the 2700 PT. If you have a newer one, you will have the drop-down list. And then when we move over to the USB-C generation, we have a 16-bit lookup table. And pretty much with this, you have the next generation and the USB-C generation, which is pretty much the same because you can then use any RGB primary to calibrate the display that you have from Palette Master Element. So a few disclaimers. This is something that I tell anybody who's watching my channel, is that if your current Palette Master Element version works, you're going to see this dialog pops up saying that, hey, a new version of software is available, you want to download it. Just say no and skip it for the time being, because there's really generally not a lot of good reasons to update unless they actually have introduced a brand new feature or something like that, or a fix on a bug that you may desperately need fixed. Then that would be the time that you would want to consider upgrading. Otherwise, just stick with the version that you have and you're going to be fine. If you have done a major operating system update, or if you have done a major software update or driver update, you may want to consider installing the latest version, but that's, those little caveats there. All right, so new in 1.3.13 on the Mac side is that we have a more, I would say, a more bolster Big Sur support, because Big Sur was supported in 0.12. However, there are some bugs, so they have fixed those bugs, and now Big Sur is supported. And I have been testing this on the Apple Silicon M1, and it does work. I have more to say about that in a few more slides, so I'm going to leave my thoughts about that just in this one line for the time being. On both Mac and Windows, there is a new black point setting that have transitioned from 1.3.12 It's now in 1.3.13 as well. It has fixed the incorrect luminance and black point issue. Some of you have been calibrating the display. For example, you set the luminance at 100. You're only able to achieve like 60 candela or something like that. That issue has been fixed. And they have also added official support for the i1 Pro 3, which is the i1 Photo Pro 3 Plus or the i1 Photo Pro 3. So if you have the new spectral photometer from X-Rite, it is now fully supported in this version now. All right. So this is a screenshot of what is new in Palette Master Element version 1.3.12, and it is still in 1.3.13, which is why you see the heading saying 0.12 there. And it's circled in red, as you see on the screen right now. Instead of having the absolute and relative black point, you can now go in and choose the value that you want for the relative black point. And I have some update on that information as well, which I'm going to share with you in a few slides. And now let's have a look at the Palette Master Element version and see which display that it would work with to calibrate. So 1.3.13 is the primary one I'm going to focus on, and if you have the SW 2700 PT running on the previous firmware, this is not going to work with 1.3.13. I have alerted BenQ to this, so hopefully a fix of this will come soon. This is especially important if you are running the SW 2700 PT, and if you have the one from the previous firmware generation and you have an Apple M1 processor, because that would be the only way to calibrate it on the M1 to use the latest version of Palette Master Element. Otherwise, everything seems to be good so far. The SW 2700 PT, the newer firmware, works just fine. All the other SW displays seems to calibrate just fine with 1.3.13. I haven't faced any of the Adobe color shift bug that was present in the other version of Palette Master Element, for example 1.3.8, but we're really going back about 5 or 6 versions there. Stability is okay on the PC side. On the Mac side, there is a possible issue with the system UI logging you out or the system UI crashing when you're using a LUT profile type. So here's the thing with 1.3.13, 0.12, and also with 0.11 as well. The thing is this, I have encountered the system lockout myself. If you want to try to calibrate your display using a 16-bit LUT, you certainly can do that. If your system abruptly locks you out into the lock-in screen, this is the reason why. It's because that LUT profile type has some conflict in the Mac operating system that causes a system UI crashing. Pretty much when this happens, all of your program and app would quit. When you launch in again, it will ask you if you want to restore the session. If you don't want to lose your work, I recommend sticking with metrics as for now for the profile type. The thing is this, I have had conversation with many of the commenters in my video, and truth be told, we like to think that using the LUT's better, but there's a lot of misinformation about that. Number one, when we're talking about LUT inside Palette Master Element, we're talking about the method that is being used to generate the ICC table that you would use for your profile. It has nothing to do with the built-in LUT on the display at all. Those are two different LUT, even though they use the same name. Ideally, instead of showing the profile type as a 16-bit LUT, it would be better to use a terminology such as table or something like that, rather than using the 16-bit LUT terminology, but that's pretty much the one that BenQ have decided to use, so I want to give us some clarification on that. Essentially, it's two different methods of building a LUT, and if you'd like to find out more about it, I'll put a video link up here and also in the description below, which I have described that in detail. Secondly, on 1.3.13, there is the Apple M1 support, which I mentioned before already in one of the keynotes earlier, but essentially it's now being supported on the M1. Now, depending on where you're at, I know some people have issues with getting this to support on the M1 just fine. Some of you are saying that you're not getting stable result. This is pretty much going to be, I would say, machine dependent. So if you are able to get consistent result, that's fantastic. In my testing, I will show you what the device I have used to run the testing. So far, I have tested, I have calibrated, I restarted the machine. The profile seems to stick. The color doesn't go back funky and weird again. So everything tends to work on my system. However, if it doesn't work on yours yet, just know that 1.3.13 is not necessarily the full version that it will work with M1 in its entirety, that won't have any issues. This is pretty much like a preliminary release that does work on the M1 processor. So if you run into issues, that may be the reason why. A few things about the different profile on Mac and PC. As you can see here, the logout bug still exists in 1.3.13. I know many of you have been using LUT for calibration and you have no issues whatsoever. and that's perfectly fine. That's great. Just keep using LUT. If you run into an issue like I have, then obviously I would not use the LUT profile type. Safe profile for Mac would still be Metrics. This is the one that I would recommend right now, and you can kind of see the chart based on the version of Palette Master Element that you run or have right there. The black point recommendation, I made some changes in the latest version of Palette Master Element. So 1.3.13, 1.3.12, where you put in the value, rather than putting 0.1 for the nit value, I have been testing a lot of this, and 0.3 tends to produce the best gradation or the best tonal scaling on the black side of things, while also maintaining the deep dark black colors and the deep dark black tones as well. I'm going to do another separate video on this later on, talking about the different variation in the nit settings so that you don't have to do the testing yourself. But as of right now, what I can tell you is that 0.3 nits tends to be a value that works really well in my testing. This is on both Mac and PC. So on PC side of things, 16-bit LUT works just fine. There are no bugs that I have known of. Then you can kind of just take a look at all the other settings there in the chart. Moving on to the best calibration setting, pretty much these are the same settings as I recommend in 1.3.12. As you can kind of see there, they're pretty much the same. The only thing that changes when you go to version 1.3.11 or anything before that, the reason why you're seeing the difference there is because the program is programmed a little bit differently, or is developed a little differently, where you don't have the opportunity to go in and dial the relative black values, for instance. That's the reason why you're seeing these charts split up this way, but you can kind of look at the chart. You can pause this video to look at that. A few more things I want to mention, and some of you have been asking me this question as well, is that can I calibrate it with sRGB Primary? Absolutely, you can certainly do that. You can use any RGB Primary that works well with your workflow. Here's where I stand right now with all these settings. I'm recommending the best setting to get the most color out of these display. However, if your workflow revolves around sRGB and you want to keep everything into sRGB color space, you can certainly do that and just use sRGB as the RGB primary when you run the calibration. A few things I want to note about the M1 processor when I'm running the calibration is that I was able to achieve a fairly consistent result. The way how I do this is pretty much I've calibrated the display using different calibrators, using different settings, and what I have done is restart the system. And normally this is a really good indicator I've found out, is that sometimes when I restart the system, the color will go back and become oversaturated again. I find that this happens if I use 16-bit LUT, but if I change the profile type to matrix, I don't have that problem anymore with any device that I've used to run the calibration on the system. So for me, I'm able to achieve a pretty consistent result. I know some of you have been commenting on my videos saying that I am not able to get a good result yet. Well, essentially, as of right now on the M1 processor, it's still in its preliminary support. So I don't think it's supposed to be running fully on there yet, or supposed to be working at 100%. But the fact that it works right now, I think is great. Your result may vary, as I mentioned before. And the other thing to note too is that I'm running on Big Sur 11.2 beta. So that's maybe a slight variation there that you may have on your system compared to mine, because I know that publicly 11.1 is available, but I'm running on 11.2 beta. So there may be some differences that happens in there. Another thing that those of you who own Apple Mac Mini M1 processor is going to be happy about is that the HDMI output on the M1 processor does not truncate the signal. So you're getting the full 0 to 255 signal output. So you can use that with a hardware calibrated display without any issues. I've actually done a calibration using the HDMI running natively on the system, and it works just fine. So that's good news to all of us right there. Here are a few of the devices that I have been running testing on the M1 Mac Mini along with Palette Master Element with. That is the i1 Display Pro, the i1 Display Pro Plus. I have also used the i1 Studio, Spider X, and also Spider 5. Something to note about Spider 5 is that when you try to calibrate with Spider 5, there is a lot of crush tones, even though you have increased the relative black value or the nit value to a pretty much high number. For example, doing it at 0.3, I get much better tonal scaling out of all the other devices compared to the Spider 5. This is something that we have seen in the Spider 5 calibration with other BenQ SW displays running on other computers for both Mac and PC as well. So if you have a Spider 5 device, you may want to consider upgrading to either an X-Rite i1 Display Pro or an i1 Display Pro Plus or something like that, because that's going to give you a much better calibration result in the long run. Here are some of my recommendations with regards to Palette Master Element is that stick with the version that you have if it works. Again, I mentioned this before already, so I'll leave that there. If you're updating to macOS 11 Big Sur, then you would need at least 1.3.12 because anything before that would not work. And if you're running on 1.3.12, if you're already on Big Sur, I recommend upgrading to 1.3.13 because it's going to give you a more stable result from the calibration. For the M1 support, you're going to need the 1.3.13, which we have been talking about in this video. And again, as I mentioned, don't update unless there is a bug that you need fixed. So under very specific circumstances that I mentioned here, for example, if you're running on the latest Mac, then yeah, consider upgrading. For Windows, everything is fine. You can stick with the previous version that you may have, and that's going to be okay. So I hope that you find this guide on Palette Master Element version 1.3.13 helpful. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments section below. Give this video a like, subscribe if you're new, hit on the bell to be notified every time I upload cool new contents like this. And until next time, in art we trust.